Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. If you allow me, I would like to start with a quote that I think captures the mood in Bosnia and Herzegovina today. Between the fear that something would happen and the hope that still it wouldn't, there is much more space than one thinks. On that narrow, hard, bare, and dark space, a lot of us have spent their lives. Remarkably, this was written by Ivo Andrić, Nobel Prize winner, just shortly after the Second World War. So this month marks 30 years since the Bosnian War ended, a conflict that killed over 100,000 people, displaced millions, and saw the Srebrenica massacre, Europe's deadliest atrocity after the Second World War. The Dayton Agreement has kept Bosnia still and in peace for 30 years, for 3 decades, and that is a major achievement. But still, it also left the state in a kind of locked or trapped state of paralysis. To discuss Dayton's legacy, its intentions, and what it did or did not achieve, we are joined today by 2 extraordinary guests. Chris Hill, US diplomat and expert on European affairs, who was on the front lines of the Dayton negotiations, working closely with all parties to help bring peace to Bosnia. And Jim O'Brien, senior US official, who played a vital behind-the-scenes role, providing guidance and coordination to help make this historic agreement a reality. So now I'm delighted to invite my dear colleague, Ilva, to lead us into conversation with our 2 amazing guests. Ilva, up to you.
Thank you so much for your impressive opening remarks. Maja Piščević, our colleague, Atlantic Council's Europe Center Senior Fellow, joining us from Belgrade. Welcome, Jim and Chris. As I think the question today is pretty stark. Where does Bosnia go from here after 30 years of Dayton? Before we start with today and the future, I want to walk a little bit down the memory lane with both of you to the quiet hills of Dayton in Ohio, where 30 years ago, a landmark deal ended 4 years of mass slaughter in Bosnia. The legacy of Dayton Agreement continues to shape Bosnia and Herzegovina for better or worse. But I wanted to ask you first, what made the US diplomacy move in the direction to stop what initially was thought as ethnic cleansing, then after that we know was pure genocide, while the European allies were reluctant to intervene? How did the US navigate the arguments by all sides, given the widespread but mistaken perception that all parties were equally responsible? Did the US have any favorite in that war? Jim, I'll start with you first.
Thanks, Ilva. It's nice to be here. So why did this happen when it did? The UN and EU had been heavily involved in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Our British and French allies, along with the Danes and the Dutch famously, and a number of other countries, had troops on the ground in Bosnia as UN peacekeepers. They were, by 1995, recognizing that they weren't doing a great job of keeping a peace. And they were also taking a fair number of casualties and becoming themselves factors in the way that the war was being conducted, sometimes being used as hostages, sometimes as shields. And I think they were becoming fed up with the role that they were playing. There had been several years of diplomacy led by the then European communities becoming the Union and then the UN together. And that diplomacy outlined many of the features of what became Dayton. Now, why did the US become involved when it did? The US diplomatic effort began really in 1994 when the US brokered a ceasefire and what became the Federation Agreement between Bosnian Croats and the Bosniak side. The there was a long period where the U.S. played a leading role, but hadn't yet become the leading negotiator. Why did that change? First, the U.S. became more active when our European partners started to say that they were going to leave. And the U.S. would be responsible for helping them leave in what would be very trying circumstances. And then we found ourselves in the summer of 1995 with the offensives against the enclaves that had been building for some time and culminated in the genocide around Srebrenica, after which the President Clinton decided that the U.S. had to lead an effort to bring about a peace or somehow change the situation on the ground fundamentally. That was what led the U.S. to come in. So it was in direct response to Srebrenica. But I don't know, Chris, if you have more to add on that.
What's your recollection of those days, Chris, Ambassador Hill?
Well, first of all, I largely agree with Jim's explanation of the origin of this. Essentially, we had a UN force. When you send in a UN force, the idea is they're there with the mutual consent of the parties. So they wear, powder blue baseball hats, and otherwise are very lightly armed and have tanks painted in white, but it was a sense that they're trying to keep a peace. Well, there was no peace to keep. And indeed, at a certain point in the summer of '95, I think the Europeans understood that, and they started sending in some real war fighters, the British and the French sending in green helmeted troops. So there was an understanding that a crisis was really brewing. And of course, as Jim noted, the fact that in order to get this UNPROFOR force out of Bosnia, they were all over the place. They were in little packages of a few people here and there. And so we put together, the U.S. and our allies put together a plan to evacuate them. And the plan involved sending about 25,000 troops in, warfighting troops, to get them out. So there was a sense that one way or the other, we were going to get more involved. So why not say, if you're going to have 25,000 troops, why don't you have them in supporting a peace process rather than evacuating UNPROFOR? So that's one point that I think is very important. But Ilva, I agree with you that the casualties among civilians were mounting, and the whole issue was kind of making a mockery of a Europe whole and free. But there was another casualty that I think we were all very aware of, and that was the U.S.-European relationship, the transatlantic relationship. The more this went on, the more acrimonious the relationship got as the blame game increased and fingers were pointed at each other. And so if you extrapolated where we were having more and more problems with the Europeans, less and less peace to actually keep, and a sense that if we don't get in, if we don't take the lead, it's going to get worse. The Europeans had tried very hard. They appointed an extremely effective negotiator, former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. But ultimately, it was decided that the U.S. Needed to come in with its own peace plan. So some plans were drawn up. Some of them, frankly, from the point of view of those of us who had worked on the problem for a while, didn't make a lot of sense. I mean, there were ideas that I thought were kind of out there. But we eventually decided on the basic contact group plan, the 5149. And so we got in there, and ultimately Dayton was an implementation of the contact group with all participants. And by the way, I mean, it seems like ancient history, but one of the participants was, of all countries, Russia. So we kind of got everyone together and worked it through. And, is it a just peace? Well, any peace that involves compromises is not going to be easy for anyone to stomach. And I think to a great extent, we are living with the legacy of that.
One question for you, Ambassador Hill. Did the U.S. get involved in this negotiation with the idea that all the parties were responsible, or was one of the ethnic parties more influential?
Ilva, I don't remember us sitting around trying to figure out who was responsible for this mess. I think there was a broad understanding, and I think this was in our talking points repeatedly, that everyone has been involved in bad stuff, but the Serbs bore a special responsibility because they had been involved in more bad stuff than the other participants. So there was a tipping of the scale to blame the Serbs. But when you're trying to, work out a peace deal, you probably don't emphasize that. What you try to do is come up with some arrangements where people, despite this hideous history that everyone's lived through, you try to come up with a plan where people can live with it. So I would say our focus was on that. And with the understanding, and I might add, one of the key elements going on here was a war crimes tribunal. And so the idea of a war crimes tribunal was that you would eventually sort out who was responsible for crimes and bring them up to trial. And then that was subsequently done.
Jim, when the Dayton Accords were drafted in those days you spent in Dayton, Ohio, did you ever imagine back then that this accord will define Bosnia's political life for this long, even 30 years after?
No, it's one of the questions that's often asked about Dayton is whether it made sense to have a political arrangement agreed at the time, and in particular the Constitution. And really, it was the parties who insisted on it, particularly the Bosniak side, but the other two major negotiating groups as well. Because they wanted to convert the wartime power that they felt, or the ambitions they had, into some lasting political form. So the challenge in working on the governing arrangements, both the Constitution and then a few of the other parts of the agreement that went to how Bosnia would be governed, the challenge was to make something that would address this immediate need so that the parties would lay down their weapons, but would also allow for some evolution over time. And I'll say there were a couple of things that were particularly challenging. The first was there was no clear European perspective for Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time of Dayton. There's only one brief reference to a European future anywhere in the agreement, and this was before any of the enlargements, the existence of the enlargement process. So there wasn't a body of law or a way we could point toward how change would come to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Though the result was that we needed to create some mechanisms for change to come, but without having this very clear path available. That involved both the Office of the High Representative, but within the governing arrangements, all the parties agreed to things like a constitutional court that would directly apply European law, even as that law changed, and that would change some of the governing arrangements. It also provided that the governing arrangements would alter and the central government would take on more responsibilities as Bosnia became more integrated into international bodies. So there was this tension between making sure that the snapshot at the end of the war was clearly reflected so each party felt comfortable, but also acknowledging that change had to be a part of the structure going forward. That really set up the tensions that we live with to this day.
And talking about those tensions, Ambassador Hill, do you think that Dayton built a peace that came at the expense of functionality? Why do I say that? Is that the sentiment by local experts that we have been talking to is that Dayton did not provide a future for Bosnia beyond just ending the war. Do you think that Bosnia's today political deadlock is the predictable outcome of a system where ethnic votes override civic needs?
I really don't. And I think it's very easy to look at problems today and say, how do we have these problems? The answer is an agreement that was done 30 years ago. But as Jim said, the idea of Dayton was supposed to be a living, breathing agreement. And the only issue that we put outside the bounds of Dayton was to get your way by force. So certainly there was a hope, and I'm first to say that hope is never a good basis for policy, but there was a hope that there would be much more, parties would become more issues-based and less sectarian-based. But ultimately, I mean, I've been in conferences where I've heard people from Bosnia say, well, we have these Croat schools and we have these Serb schools, and that's all because of Dayton. It's not. You'd be very hard pressed to find any reference to segregating schools in Dayton. So I think a lot of this comes to the question of if you want to blame somebody, and this works for life in general, you might want to start with a mirror and look at yourself and wonder, what have you done to deal with this? But to suggest that the problem was, those Americans 30 years ago, or those Austro-Hungarians 100 years ago, or the Ottomans 200 years ago, is a little tiresome. I mean, I think the problem Dayton has is that 30 years ago, everyone was focused on this. I mean, we had top people there. I mean, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was totally involved in this. And today, there are other things going on in the world. I always remember President Clinton talking to a group of people from the Balkans saying, the spotlight's on you today, but it won't always be. So I think a big problem that remains is the inability or failure to talk to each other, except to talk about who's responsible for the past. And I understand a bunch of historians talking that way, but if you're a politician today and you're looking at the uphill climb that Bosnia has, forget about European Union. I mean, look at the uphill climb just to retain their population. I mean, we used to be talking about a country that was more like 4 million people. Now it's more like 3 million people. These are challenges, and they're challenges that I think all the communities need to try to do a better job of meeting together, rather than enlisting foreigners and then blaming the foreigners for what they did or didn't do.
We will have the opportunity to have our audience ask questions later on during this conversation. But I want first to ask you, Jim, do you think it's the time for the international community to rethink its entire approach towards Bosnia and Herzegovina? I know that you are writing a paper or a book on this subject. Can you share something with our audience? Any potential recommendation?
I'm definitely not writing a book. But I've written a few papers. Here's the way I would look at it. For Bosnia to become a normal European state, it needs to adopt some practices that Europe has come to adopt over the last 40 or 50 years. And those include real changes in the way that political parties exercise control within their countries. So part of what happened at Dayton, and it wasn't just at Dayton, right? Dayton inherited a set of negotiations and understandings where all the parties were comfortable. There was a little air of Yugo nostalgia there, that things had to be done in a kind of collectivist way, or all things had to be divided. The three groups had to be working together. The decisions could be vetoed by any one of them, and Dayton modified some of that. But there was still a feeling that ultimately a political party that got into government would have incredible amounts of control over the economy, over jobs, over money, and over other factors. And that has changed in Europe over the last 50 years, so that no longer are state-owned enterprises as dominant or controlled by appointees of the latest winning party. They can't dish out public contracts just to friends and family. And on down the list, we need those rules to become the norm in Europe. I suspect if they do, then you will find that parties become a little more issue-based. As Chris said, was a hope. You'll find more parties based on issues than on pure sectarian politics. Why do I think that? Because the sectarian politics is rooted in a leader saying, I'm the one who will take care of you. And that encourages a certain amount of division, and it encourages authorities and money to be given to each constituent people rather than to the common institutions. That change will come from the EU. I think it is one of the reasons that EU integration is such a difficult topic in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because a politician who's making money by not being part of the EU is going to be very reluctant to let it go along. Now, exactly how we move to that point, I think it's, as Chris said, this isn't issue one for the international community. I think it's much better to come from voices within Bosnia and Herzegovina than it is to wait for an international to have a plan and then implement it over several years.
Ambassador Hill, if you want to elaborate a little bit more on your position on that, because we know where the local politicians are, and we have seen the almost perpetual stagnation happening. So what's your suggestion there? Well,
I mean, we're not going to go in and go after local politicians for violating local laws. They're going to have to, that is something the Bosnian people are going to have to get more fed up with than they've been. Now, some of this criminality that you're alluding to is masked with this idea of some kind of ethnic patriotism, and we know how that has worked. But I'm not sure this is something that we can go in and solve for them. There's no question that Bosnia needs to understand whether it wants to be a very federalist state, which I think is probably the right outcome for Bosnia, or a more unitary state. And there's even, I think, a failure to come to terms on that. So I guess what bothers me the most is I don't think there is a sufficient dialogue among the parties, among the peoples themselves. And I think we all need to encourage that much more, but I don't think we can do it for them. And that's the big difference from 30 years ago. We cannot do it for them at this point.
I would encourage our audience online, which I'm told is numerous, please do submit your question at askac.org so we can help the conversation, and we can have our guests answer your questions. And since we are in this point, Jim, what should Washington and Brussels do in order to respond to, let's say, a leader who undermines the very state Dayton created, and especially after the mixed signals with the delisting from the US?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably a few things. So the first is Washington and Europe, which Brussels, has the enlargement tool, but key capitals as well, need to be more clearly coordinating and sharing views about what should happen. I think
do you know if they are communicating, sharing views?
I don't know. I'm not a reporter on this, but I think it doesn't look to me. It looks like there's a fair bit of drift, maybe some low-level communication, but there's not certainty about what the strategic vision is. That was a thing that both Chris and I have worked very hard at during the times we've been in government, where it's sort of constant talk about where we were going to go. That seems to have broken down. But I think more to it, the one thing the international community can affect are the incentives facing politicians. So Mr. Dodik, I think, is an ultimate rational actor, as much as I dislike many of his actions. But he came into politics as a reformer because there was space to be a reform politician. The electorate in Srpska then changed. It became almost entirely Serb. It was just barely majority Serb in 2005 or so, but they changed the voting rules and the nationalist parties all lost and dissolved. So he took over that space. That has allowed him to control resources. European countries have gone through the same thing over years, and they can make clear that the progress toward the EU, progress toward the single market, depends on changing that control. That would have a real impact on the way that the three dominant parties, the HDZ under Mr. Čović, the SDA under the Izetbegović family, and in particular with Mr. Dodik and Republika Srpska, it would just change the incentives. They then have an incentive to engage with each other rather than to separate and divide the spoils. That's the one thing that internationals can do. But the exact balance of central versus local powers, what authorities go where, that really is for people in Bosnia and Herzegovina to decide. It won't be decided by people like me in Washington, who every 5 years show up, in some different government job.
Ambassador Hill, how do you feel about this? Cooperation between Brussels and DC?
Yeah, it's correct. I mean, as your opening suggests, the history of what happened hangs very heavily over the country. And I think it is hard for people to say, okay, let's bygones be bygones and let's talk about what we need to do in the future. It's clearly difficult. That said, I think if we think of government as a set of responsibilities, a set of services, really, if we think of it as something where a politician should not become a billionaire because of service in government. And by the way, without editorializing, I'm going to say that Bosnia is not the only country that has these issues. But if you can kind of, boil down what it is that governance needs to do and can there be agreements on it, I think you should be able to. I'm very worried, though, about the out-migration in Bosnia. If you go to Vojvodina in Serbia, you see a lot of people who used to live in Bosnia. They've left. I think you see a lot of people in Western Europe who used to live in Bosnia. I think there's a real problem of depopulation. And sometimes it's some of the high IQ immigrants are causing this issue, because a lot of people just don't want to stay and don't want to deal with these issues. So what can we as foreigners do about this? On this issue of nationalist parties, we banned some of them at Dayton. I mean, we did that. But we also understood that wasn't going to last for 30 years. I mean, that we're going to get these parties. If there's, as Jim said, if there's space for people to behave, they're going to fill that vacuum. So it's really something where I know our kind of body language is what can we do, but I really think Bosnians need to kind of look in the mirror and say, what can I do today to make this a better country?
Please continue to submit your questions. I'm receiving them as we speak at askac.org. But before, I do have some more questions for Ambassador Hill and for Jim, and then we'll continue with the questions. EU membership and potential NATO membership. Looks like the Bosnian citizens overwhelmingly support the EU path, not NATO as much. Jim, do you see a potential NATO membership for Bosnia and Herzegovina? And you have been a staunch believer on the EU accession of the region, including Bosnia as well. Do you think that the EU process can succeed without the constitutional blockages that are created in the country?
The blockages are to do with the practices of the parties. The Constitution, you could either make no changes or kind of small changes to some of the vetoes, but it's the way that the dominant parties have incentives to block EU integration that is the problem. And that's purely a matter of, it's a matter of making clear to Bosnian voters and also to the parties that benefits will not flow. So as one example, the EU has a great deal of difficulty in providing assistance and giving benefits to parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but not to parts that are blocking, whether it's the energy corridor that needs to flow through Herzegovina or some of the actions in Republika Srpska that have caused problems. That makes it difficult for them to make clear what behavior is acceptable. That's an international problem that directly affects the ability to shape relations with Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I hope that's able to be changed, but it's a frustrating element of the discussion. Again, this is about the incentives that are created for political leaders. They should have the incentive to deliver services for their people. They should have the incentive to work with one another in order to expand the economy. And I want to really agree strongly with Chris on this. This is a country that runs the risk of dying. I mean, the outmigration rate is extraordinary. And other countries in the region, particularly Serbia, are starting to do very well. They're getting closer to European norms of manufacturing and beginning to make the leap toward being an advanced economy. I think Albania has made remarkable strides in recent years, where in Tirana, I think 25% of the economy is in IT rather than, I mean, you would know this maybe better, Ilva, but you know, whereas a decade or more ago, it wasn't at all a part of the economy. Those countries will do very well. Bosnia and Herzegovina is trapped because a set of political leaders benefit by being the boss of a small group within a small country. And that is where the incentives have to change.
Chris, on NATO,
Let me add a little on the European Union. I mean, it's very easy for American diplomats, even easier for former diplomats, to say that Europe ought to, you know, just invite everybody in, full stop. In fact, Europe has its own challenges, and I think we need to be respectful of that. We also need to respect the fact that in 500 years of European history, I don't think there's been a more exciting political development than the creation of the European Union. It's been a great success. So the question is, can there be some respect? Can it take responsibility for some of these countries that are not doing well? And not doing well for a lot of reasons. You know, it was easy to take the first tranche, a little more difficult for the next tranche, and a little more difficult for the tranche after that. And now it's, I think, very difficult to look at Bosnia as a prospective member. That said, I think, and again, I'm very reluctant to give advice to people who, you know, I'm not a member of the European Union, but I hope there'll be some thought given to the idea that let's get them in. Let's maybe create some kind of status that's not the same status as the country's already in, some kind of probationary status, some kind of status that limits the ability of a country coming in to turn around and prevent the next country from coming in, which I think is a big problem right now, especially in the region. So can the European Union look at that? I think there's been a lot of good work, and I give Jim a lot of credit for this, which is the European Union embracing of this idea of let's make accessible the single market, because that's a big part of the issue, of course. And can access to the single market be accomplished even in the absence of full membership rights? So I hope something like that can go forward. It's hard, it's difficult, and it's not the top priority, but I hope something like that can go forward. On the question of NATO, NATO has been successful because of its standards. I mean, it is the world's foremost defense alliance, and there's just nothing else like it. I mean, it is truly extraordinary. So I think there have to be some military standards, and even if the political standards, you know, are more difficult in some ways, but we need to be very clear that when NATO steps into a problem, game over. You know, no more. You know, I never want a situation where people kind of doubt NATO's resolve or doubt NATO's capability. That said, I think the open door that NATO has kept, the fact that Macedonia, which was being tormented by its neighbors and earlier entrants to the European Union, NATO moved very quickly to get Macedonia in, and I credit NATO and I credit the attitude of NATO for that. So I hope, I think both these organizations, NATO and the European Union, are just powerful leverage, and I hope we can use it wisely, but maybe even use it more often.
Jim, how would you answer to a critic who says that Bosnia cannot really join EU being an ethnocracy?
I would focus first on making the reforms at home and getting the benefits of the single market. I think, as Chris says, the decision about, and the European leaders are very clear, they need to make some decisions about how Europe will make decisions going forward before they bring people in. So ethnocracy or not, for me, the problem with even the word ethnocracy, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what it means, except that too much power goes to each party that happens to win an election within the different pieces of Bosnia. And I got to give credit to, there's an incredibly vibrant democracy at the municipal and cantonal levels in Bosnia. You see a lot of rotation of power, a lot of interesting coalitions. The difficulty is that when you start to move up to the entity level and at the central level, the party that wins takes huge resources and distributes it in order to stay in power. That's the difficulty, whether that's based on constituent people's lines or ideological lines or any other. And that's something the EU should be able to fix if the process can get going.
You both mentioned the fact that people, especially in Bosnia, but from the region in general, have left their countries in despair of the slow progress and lack of tangible results when it comes to enlargement, until Montenegro and Albania are finally moving a little bit forward towards that goal. But I wanted to ask you about the fact that what Dayton designed 30 years ago may not reflect the quotas of the ethnicities now in the country. And that may be a problem in the decision making to approve the EU reforms that are needed. Jim. Chris?
Yeah, I think
Whoever
you're referring to the fact that there's been a population shift. There are probably more people who identify themselves as Bosniak than there are who identify themselves as Bosnian Serbs. I think you can't redesign your government because of immigration issues. Lebanon hasn't had a census since the 1930s. And it's not because they don't have the capability of having a census. They don't want to have a census because they know it could result in enormous political possible changes and certainly unrest. I'm not sure that's the issue. I think for now it's a 51-49 land division, if you will, but I think there's plenty of space on the Dayton platform to do a lot more than has been done. So once again, I don't think it's the basic rules of the game that are wrong. I think it's the people interpreting the rules at this point. This 51-49, when we were in Dayton, Ohio, working on this, we were all concerned about the inter-entity boundary line. We were concerned about whether there'd be fighting breaking out there. We were concerned about whether there'd be land grabs across the line. I mean, it was, we didn't like to think of that, but that was the number one issue. I mean, the last week in Dayton had to do with the map. And we were pleased to see in the fullness of time that it's not so much map issues, it's more, it's political issues. But we're clearly not there yet. But I mean, to Bosnia, to anyone living there, they need to take some responsibility for this issue, because I think we're kind of done with. I mean, there's a lot of argument that we shouldn't even have a high representative there anymore, and this could be rather this could be quite a cold shower for a lot of people. No more high representatives, so. It's high time people began to look at the set of arrangements, governance, and see what they can do to improve it.
That was my next question. You kind of burned it for the role of OHR, Jim. What do you think? How should it be revised after 28 years?
Well, it's always evolving. So a simple bit of history. When we were at Dayton, it became apparent that there needed to be a senior civilian. the mandate of the senior civilian tracks exactly, it mirrors the mandate of the senior military commander, who had plenipotentiary power over any use of force, basically. And the civilian authority had the mirroring authority over everything else. Initially, the idea was that the civilian authority would help with reconstruction and gradually begin helping to build up practices of governance. It was a fairly light operation because the initial tasks were, as Chris was implying, I think, the initial tasks were to make sure the war actually ended, get the parties separated, demilitarized, and stop things. So then the high rep evolved over the next year into something that was much more robust because activity shifted from war to politics. It was very heavily engaged at various points over the next, say, 15 to 20 years, then was a very light touch. Now, again, people see the need for a little bit more engagement because you have frankly, parties that are so entrenched. It's very difficult for oppositions or for popular protests to change the party's policies. Maybe we're at a stage of a further evolution. I don't think you can get rid of the structure at this point until you change the incentives that politicians have. But again, I'm an American who's out of work. So maybe I'm not.
You keep saying that you go in the region once in 5 years, which is not true. We know that's not true. Okay, I wanna invite now one of our experts that has joined this conversation for an on-screen question. Damir Kapicic. He's a professor of political science and director at the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Sarajevo. Damir, please ask your question.
Thanks, Silva. So I've been enjoying this conversation a lot, and clearly Dayton succeeded in doing what it was intended to do, what it was designed to do. But one element that it did not do was enable a dialogue about a vision for the country. For over 30 years, there has been no such dialogue, largely due to entrenched political leaders. And I have two questions. One would be, what is it that Washington and Brussels can do to encourage a broad dialogue on what Bosnia should become, especially towards its population? So it's not just between leaders, but between the citizens. And a second question, very brief, would you rather see a reform of Dayton or an entirely new constitution?
Thank you, Damir. Who wants to go first? Ambassador Hill?
Well, I mean, I'll just say, first of all, Dayton is not a constitution. I mean, Dayton is an agreement. There's an embedded constitution, and there are means to change that constitution. The difference was that Dayton was largely done by the international community and with the participation of the parties, but the international community did it. And right now, I think we're going to see a lot less international community. There's certainly a lot less consensus from within the international community. I mean, as I said earlier, Russia was a member of that contact group, which is kind of hard to believe. 30 years seems a long time, but amazing that Russia was involved. So I think that's one issue. But I think really, from the point of view of what needs to be done, I think we fall back in the earlier part of our conversation. The Bosnian peoples, if you will, need to decide what they want to do. And we will certainly help, but I don't think we're going to shotgun any legislation into Bosnia or change their constitution for them.
Tim O'Brien?
Yeah, I think in terms of encouraging it, I think the kind of conversation that we're talking about needs to be, do you want to join Europe? What does it mean to join Europe? And obviously, Europe is an ever-changing destination. It's quite different today than what was available in 1995. And in a couple of years, if we see the kind of far-right nationalist parties in major states, it may become a different place again. That I think it's awkward for Americans to lead that. It becomes an academic seminar because it's a decision about what rules do you want to live by. In terms of the Constitution, it is set up so it can evolve. It doesn't need to be rewritten. And I think it's very easy to suggest dumping the rules that are in place. Very hard to explain why a group of politicians that cannot agree to moderate reforms of the entity veto would be able to authorize a modern European, majoritarian or communitarian constitution. Like, so I don't have an opinion. It's for Bosnians to decide. I just think you've got one. And if you begin to apply European law, the presidency should change. That's already a decision of the European Court of Human Rights. That's allowed for by Dayton. The voting rules that are in place today are very different from the voting rules of the original Dayton. I hear politicians say they want original Dayton. Well, in the original Dayton, the electorate in Republika Srpska was majority non-Serb. If that's what people want to go back to, I suspect you'd see a different government in Srpska pretty quickly. So those decisions aren't really about changing Dayton. It's about changing how it's applied in the circumstances of the time. And I think that's available as a mechanism. That's, as a sort of Anglo-American trained lawyer, I prefer incremental change to radical adjustments. And I think it's available there. If people decide that they want to go toward Europe and they only want leaders who are committed to that, then I think it forces the other conversations we're talking about.
Thank you, Jim. Damir, are you happy with the questions?
I'm happy with the answers.
With answers. Thank you so much. I do have some questions that have arrived at our platform, askac.org. And Ambassador Hill, this is for you. There is someone who is asking, just coming from Serbia, as the most recent US ambassador to Belgrade, how do you see the influence in Bosnia or lack thereof from neighboring countries in the Western Balkans? What has been the impact of Dayton, Bosnia's regional relations over the last 30 years?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the whole question. What is the regional?
Let's start the influence in Bosnia of the neighboring countries.
Yeah.
What has been or hasn't been?
I think it's been encouraging that the neighboring countries have never, gotten together and drawn a map on a napkin and decided which part of Bosnia they want to take. To name one example that happened in the early 1990s. I think the neighboring countries have all pledged their allegiance to Dayton and to its map and its internal boundaries. So I think the regional powers have done okay in terms of recognizing Bosnia. I think more could be done, but I mean, I'll say from Serbia's perspective, I'd rather have a Serb talk about it, but I would say that Serbia has made very clear they support the Dayton Peace Accords and they support the external and internal maps. They've said it over and over again. They have, however, they have to be careful about not creating a situation where they don't care about the Serbs who live in Bosnia. That's true in Zagreb. They have to be very aware of the Croats who live in Bosnia. So the issue is really one of nuance. Do they interfere? Do they not interfere? Are they helpful? Are they not helpful? My own view is more can be done, but I think Bosnian diplomacy needs to be part of that solution. And, I know there's a very difficult legacy between Sarajevo and Belgrade, but I think it may be time to see, to try to find areas of cooperation rather than historical disagreement.
Jim, I hope you can help us answer this question. What has been the impact of Dayton on Bosnia's regional relations in the last 30 years?
Well, I mean, just a little bit. The piece we haven't done is sort of historically Dayton as an example of diplomacy. And, I think I learned a lot working with Ambassador Holbrooke, with Chris, you know, the sort of core negotiating team. I was on the legal team. One of the most important things was that it put both Zagreb and Belgrade on paper and in fact in a position of clear responsibility for seeing the agreement complied with. So rather than saying this is not your country, stay away, it was respect the rules that are set for this country, and you will be held to account if you don't. And I think that's largely held for more than 30 years. And it's an example of how one can deal with these sensitive issues where nationalities cross borders, but the borders need to be respected. Now, and you know, for one thing, Republika Srpska went into Dayton asking that it be allowed to have a completely separate international personality than the state, including agreements with whatever countries would support it. That was rejected at Dayton.
Years old, but trying to tell people all was going to be okay. Well, it wasn't. I mean, it's far away from anything. And so I don't think Bosnia, if you look at a map, I don't think it's so terrible. And I think people ought to stop lamenting their fate and get to work on a better future.
And get agency over the future. Thank you so much, Ambassador Chris Hill and Jim O'Brien. I really appreciate your thoughts, valuable insights on this topic. I want to thank you, our audience. Please do stay tuned for more events and programming as part of our Atlantic Council's Europe Center Balkans Forward initiative, with which we aim to keep the region on the foreign policy agenda here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us.